Okay, welcome back. My name is Rush Lalaviva, and I am the director of tabletop panels at Dragon Con um, and professional game master. I have with me to my left, Abby. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Abby. You might have seen me as Witty X Witch on social media. I run games and the social media for DragonCon,
And
tabletop
to my
track specifically.
yep. And to my right is Eric Mona, the chief creative officer of Paizo, uh, and someone who has had a little bit to do with the to do going on in the gaming industry.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Eric. Nice to meet you. I mean, I've met you before, but hi, everybody who's watching. Nice to meet you.
So you've had a month or two.
Yes. Yes. Hard to tell the difference between a month and 2 months, actually, this last month.
I can understand. So we're going to hear all about that here in just a minute. And so let me get this out of the way right off the bat. If you are here to hear news about the OGL or understand it or analysis of the OGL and the OGL fiasco, this is not the place for it. There are hundreds, literally hundreds of videos on that take the OGL 1.2 and the 1.0A point by point, and many of them are done by actual attorneys and some are done by IP attorneys, and so those would be much better places to go there for that. I we were more interested in the untold story, which actually I'm surprised very few people have been talking about, the untold story of the people involved. So let's very, very briefly go over what the OGL fiasco was all about. First and foremost, right when third edition hit, which is when, in my opinion, when D&D really, really exploded.
Real quick, for anyone who maybe isn't familiar with game terminology, we might want to explain what the OGL means.
Okay. Open game license. That was I don't want to make it too long, but second edition was out for a long time. It dominated the market. Everybody played a second edition. It was a very, very old edition, and then they came out with third edition. Third edition came out, and they decided, hey, we're going to make the game system open source, so anyone can use our game system and use a lot of the terminology used for a game system. And you can do this to make your own game. And around that time, this is about 20 years ago, all these D20 games came out, all kinds of D20 games, all kinds of different settings, all kinds of different licenses, using that same system. Things changed when it went to fourth edition, and then it kind of went back for fifth edition. And recently, a leak happened where they were going to release a open game license 1.2. And in this game license 1.2, there were a lot of things that people were very unhappy about. Namely, they could revoke it at any time. If you made so much money, over so much money, you had to report your earnings, and then also that you had to pay them very steep royalty fines. They were also saying if you produce anything under OGL 1.2, which you basically had to, they had full rights to your content. You would still own your content, but they could use any characters that you developed or any setting that you developed, etc. There were there were a couple other things that I'm probably leaving out, but that's the gist of it. When that happened, the gaming community exploded. People were very irate, and very recently, Wizards has walked that back, and perhaps maybe even given us something better, but we'll see. In response, many third-party publishers came up with something called the ORC. A lot of people love the fact that it spells out orc. And we will talk about what the ORC here is in just a minute. Its own open gaming license for third-party publishers. But before we get into that, because again, there are other videos that go specifically into that line by line, point by point, I would like to hear the story of this, Eric, at the Paizo offices.
Yes. Well, I'm happy to kind of tell that story. I think if I can't resist. I've been in rules lawyer mode for like a month, so there's just a couple of things that I want to just kind of add a little bit of
please
color to. The ORC license is the Open RPG Creative License, and it is actually being backed by a consortium of about 1,500 publishers. Fairly recently, we listed about 60 prominent publishers from all corners of the business, and we're talking about publishers who have been around since the birth of the hobby back in the 70s, all the way up to brand new companies just setting out on their first digital release. So it's really a wide consortium, and it's not. And the thing I just kind of wanted to correct a little bit is that it's not a consortium just of third-party publishers. The ORC license is not an attempt to replace Wizards of the Coast with just another game. Not even my game, Pathfinder. We're heavily involved in the ORC license, but it's not a Paizo license. It's not a Pathfinder license. What it is a system neutral open license that allows everybody to contribute their own games under the same sort of easily understood legal framework about what you can do and what you can't do, and some game specific guidance. And so there were companies that were not producing material directly to support D&D 5e. That's sort of that typical third-party publisher. There certainly are a lot of those in the consortium, but there's also companies that have never published Dungeons and Dragons related stuff that I think it'd be fair to call first-party publishers. There were also a consortium of virtual tabletops, online character builders. Really, the whole breadth of the industry came together to explore other opportunities when we found out that the open game license 1.0a, which had guided, been a tool that could be used by anyone for 22 years, when that looked like that was now threatened, in part because it was owned by Wizards, a lot of us decided we needed to go a separate way. I'm jumping like 4 days ahead from, I think, the story that you're mostly interested in, but just to kind of properly contextualize
No, absolutely.
So the open RPG creative license is really for all publishers and is not geared toward one specific game. And ultimately, that license will be turned over to a nonprofit organization that will not be affiliated with any publishing company. Because one of the big flaws of the OGL, as we learned about a month ago, is that it being under the control of one company means that its fate, and indeed it was always intended to be irrevocable, and that was clear in all of the guidance that was posted on Wizards website for over 20 years. So if a single company's sort of shifting self-interest could change their outlook on how that license is interpreted in a way that would allow them to basically destroy that license, then that is a big weakness strategically of the license. So there's the legal framework we need to provide from ORC, but then there's also that transition where it will not be in the hands of any particular company. And I think that after the month we've all had, that's maybe the most important part. So to rewind and to answer your question, I think the OGL, so prior to the leak of the 1.1 document, I think even the exact day that it happened, I was in a meeting about our long-term production plan. What were we going to do in 2023? What products were we planning on releasing in 2024, all the way leading up to 2025, 2026? And in that, vast timeline, there were such complicated and fun questions of like, will we be doing new editions of Pathfinder and Starfinder down the road? We've launched a new edition, second edition of Pathfinder fairly recently. But Starfinder's, been around for 6-7 years at this point. And so, when you're planning 4, 5, 6 years in advance, it's helpful to kind of have benchmarks about when certain things may happen or may not. So we were in a big product planning meeting, and then pretty much an hour after that meeting, it was like, okay, I think that may have been a wasted morning, and we may in fact need to be revising some of our thinking here. But then there was also just a little bit of a challenge and this has been a challenge for us throughout the whole story, is that a lot of the public discourse on it was based off of leaked documents, and you can look at a leaked document and go, oh, that looks pretty realistic. But, as long as it's not coming directly from the source, there is sort of a responsibility to take it with a grain of salt. And so it really wasn't until officially Wizards started replying and they'd already sort of shared some basic details, pretty much like what you just said. Oh, if you make a lot of money off it, you might have to report a royalty. But the details I don't think it had been made public until that leak, and then even then, it wasn't until Wizards started kind of getting their PR response geared up almost a week later, where it really became clear what the plans were, because they were essentially confirming a lot of the stuff in public.
Right.
So there was that interregnum there where it's like, okay, this seems like it might be happening. They've sort of telegraphed that it's happening, and now there's leaked documents that we would later find out that they essentially corroborated. But you do kind of have to start planning based on what you know. And so immediately our concerns were just, well, how is this happening? We were all at Paizo. Our owner Lisa Stevens and our president Jim Butler were on the executive team for Dungeons and Dragons when the open game license was released in the year 2000. I was working as a little cub reporter for the RPGA Network's Polyhedron magazine, and I was in the first staff meeting where the management team revealed the details of the open game license 1.0a to the staff, which I think was the first time anyone had heard about it outside the a very tight-knit management group, Ryan Dancy and others. Our lawyer, the law firm that Paizo uses, is chaired by Brian Lewis, who drafted the original OGL. And of course, Pathfinder and Paizo and some of our staff through other companies had been using the open game license for 20 years. We're very familiar with the FAQs and advice that had been on wizards.com up until about 2021 or something. And so we knew very well what the initial intention of the OGL was. And that was always a little bit of a puzzling thing for us, because some of that early PR, had some statements like, when we originally set out to make the OGL, this was what we were intending and this was the plan. And all of us were like, well, we were in the room and that's just not true. And so the first thing I think was just sort of disbelief and just like, why and how is this even happening? It's so at odds with 20 years of assurance. But when you're dealing with a mega corporation, especially one that's had as much turnover in executive management as Hasbro, Wizards of the Coast has over the last, say, 5 years, you start to kind of piece together the story, and you start to maybe start wondering either they totally don't know what they're doing, and that's terrifying enough, or they know exactly what they're doing, and that's even more terrifying. And so that's when the conversation really needed to shift between the just like, oh my God, I feel like someone's just slapped me across the face and I'm upset and surprised and don't really understand, to wait, I think they did that intentionally, but why, and trying to figure out the whys has been
you even have that in your document. We were there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's a salient point. And
yeah, it's a beautiful line.
Well, thank you kindly. But I do think that one of the reasons why it was relatively simple for us to build a consortium of publishers, that first announcement that we made of the ORC license, which I believe was on the following Thursday, that had a handful of publishers that had already kind of stepped up to be with us. That would include Green Ronin, Chaosium, Kobold Press.
So wait, real quick.
Yeah.
So kind of rewind a little bit.
Yeah.
How did that even happen? How did it even go where we need to come up with?
Okay. All right. Okay. So
idea.
To finish my point quickly, and then I'll jump back to that. The reason why it was not tremendously difficult for us to pull together a consortium is twofold. One, a lot of the people who are at the heads of those companies have also been around 20 years, and they knew full well what was going on was not appropriate. And the other thing is, I've now worked in this industry since 1999. And up until about a month ago, even though there are companies that are, theoretically chasing the same gamer or making similar product to Pathfinder and Starfinder, I feel this is true of most owners or senior managers at tabletop RPG companies, we don't really think of each other as competitors. We think of ourselves essentially as, in a weird way, kind of colleagues. We celebrate each other's successes. We play each other's games. It's very likely we've worked with one another at some point. So there is a camaraderie in the RPG scene that I think is somewhat unique in other businesses. And so maybe it's just because we all came into this loving the same type of hobby, and that makes it easier. But so it wasn't very difficult to pull together a consortium of people who'd been around as long as we had, or even a lot of new people who just were learning for the first time that this is, you know, that certain business partners will always work in their own best interest over yours. And so, okay, so to rewind, there we are. What do we do? I think it wasn't until that Tuesday where we had a opportunity to really circle up with our legal representation. They had some time to review the situation, and it just became really clear that Wizards felt very strongly that it was within their power to reinterpret the word authorized as a way to essentially blow up the OGL, you know. And since every product we publish is under the OGL, and virtually, certainly all the game products, and since we also, the community of Pathfinder compatible publishers are in a similar spot to the third-party publishers for D&D 5e, you know, they need the safety of a reliable open game license to share and iterate and move ideas down the chain. And just became clear that OGL 1.0a was, whether or not the Wizards could deauthorize it, they'd made very clear that it was their intention to do so. And so you can kind of fall back and say, well, we know, and we did say we can defend this in court if necessary. But the reality is nobody wants to go to court. That's extraordinarily expensive. And outside of a small handful of companies in this industry, no one could afford it. And so, you know, there's the, well, maybe we hold on with the tips of our fingers to the precarious OGL 1.0a in an environment where, you know, every 3 days is bringing some new disastrous development in terms of its reliability, or we could simply start working on what would come next. And I think from a Pathfinder perspective, we were also significantly helped by the fact that a few years ago we did do a new edition of our game. We did Pathfinder 2nd edition, and unlike Pathfinder 1st edition, where we found ourselves in a very similar breakdown of communications around the 4th edition launch of the game, and we had a whole pipeline of 3.5 compatible adventures in the form of the Pathfinder Adventure Path, which I think we are working on number 193 of monthly releases since what I'm talking about right now, right? So we had a lot of products in the pipeline. And so then the real goal was, okay, Wizards is not going to really have a viable open game license for 4th edition. Even though they've been telling us for 6 months they were going to show us early stuff so that we could get on board right away to help support the new edition. None of that came to fruition. There was a lot of, I think, internal confusion at the time back in 2008 or whatever it was. And so they would say, here's the plan, and then nothing would come. There was one point where everyone was going to have to pay $5,000 just to like prove they were for real to be able to use the new license for 4th edition. And then that never happened. And it was just extremely confusing and alarming. And we're burning daylight. We had product that needed to be out. We knew we needed to release monthly stuff. We had a big Gen Con planned. And so that back then is what led us to do Pathfinder 1st edition. And a lot of people at the time called Pathfinder 1st edition like 3.75. Right. And part of that is because a not insignificant portion of the Pathfinder core rulebook was pretty much the same as the 3.5 rules, which was allowed under the open game license. But the real thing about the open game license in general is in the very difficult topic that I think all game companies have been grappling with over the last month is the kind of realization that in terms of legal precedent, game rules cannot be copyrighted. So your roll this number of dice and move this many spaces, very simple kind of ideas are not copyrightable. That being said, it seems clear that exact expressions of those rules are under copyright. And under the OGL, it's sort of a gentle person's agreement. Nobody needs to really worry about what that gray line is, which is certainly nothing that's been tested, in a major way. Whereas like board game rules have been tested all the way up to the Supreme Court. So so the open game license allows for sharing of that material, kind of whether it's copyright or not, because everyone's agreeing that they're just going to kind of be gentle with each other, I guess you could say. And so so when it came to let's see, when it came to Pathfinder 2nd edition, although there's certainly classes and levels and spells and things like that, one of the directives we gave our designers was start with a blank sheet of paper. We don't want to see any verbatim copied text from the SRD. We really want Pathfinder to be able, I'd sort of said, like, in my head, I want whoever's doing the next edition, which I guess would be 3rd edition of Pathfinder down the road, I would like it to give them the opportunity, if it made business sense and if there was some problem with the OGL, to just be able to walk away from it entirely. So we did the majority of that work during the 2nd edition design process. So we knew that what we were getting out of the OGL in 2023 was much more that, okay, other people can share our rules expressions rather than let's just keep on copying, the 3.5 SRD. Pathfinder 2 is quite a distance from 3.5. And part of the reason why was to allow us to have more independence in the future, should that become necessary. And it just turned out it became necessary a hell of a lot sooner than any of us were anticipating, on the 1st of January of this year, when within a week or two, all of a sudden the whole industry was thrown into tumult by Wizards of the Coast. I think in retrospect, it's fair to say disastrous decision to start getting cutesy with the terminology of a agreement that everyone had worked with peacefully and productively and profitably with for over 2 decades. So then we started saying, all right, so if we only are really using the OGL primarily for the downstream sharing, what do we do to kind of maintain that environment? What do we do to provide other companies, whether they're plugging into Pathfinder, whether they're plugging into whatever, the sort of framework for cooperation, innovation, and collaboration that the industry as a whole has enjoyed under the open game license since 2000. So that's when we started talking about, okay, we need to create another license. At the same time, my design team is going to have to start working on, if we use the terminology of the open game license, and forgive me for getting a little technical here, but the open game license is really a 2-piece plan. You've got the license that gives the legal framework, but then companies can also plug in open game content that they release under that license. And one of the primary ways of doing that is through something the open game license calls a system reference document, or SRD. And so, for example, the Dungeons and Dragons rules for 3.5 and 5.1 were released as a system reference document so other people could riff on that. Other companies have done the same. With the new upcoming ORC license, we will have to do an SRD as well, and that will involve some tightening up and taking a look at the rules and making sure that they're some of that gray area of like, this is unprotectable, but what about these 8 things all in the same package? Is that potentially an issue? We've created so much Pathfinder 2nd edition material at this point that the handful of monsters and things that are arguably derived from the SRD have become less and less important to us all the time. So we've got a design thing to set up a new SRD, but also then the legal framework that'll be provided by the org license. And throughout this process, other companies will likely be doing the same thing so that they can release, I don't know if they'll be called system reference documents under the org license, but the same idea. And so, so we're working on that side of it. We're working on the orc license part of it. I think that the just more behind the scenes stuff. So we on that was Tuesday. Over the next 2 days, about 8 of us collaborated on what would ultimately become the strategy for the orc license, and then the announcement that we did that Thursday. And so I worked till about 4 a.m. 2 nights in a row. We were editing, re-editing, making sure that we were saying things the right way and that it fit with our current plans. And then on Thursday, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, there was going to be I don't know if there was going to be or if everyone thought there was going to be sort of a big announcement from Wizards where they were going to officially roll out, 1.1 or whatever. They had changed it because there was already quite a lot of controversy in the community. So I think everyone was anticipating some level of changes. But again, all of their public communications made it pretty clear that they weren't likely to back off from deauthorization. So we had our plan ready to go, probably to respond to their, live stream or whatever. But as the day went on, it became clear that the controversy had grown so big that they were no longer going to be doing a public announcement. And
Right, yeah.
then so we're like standing there with everything ready to go, and it's like, you know what, just let it go. It's so important that and maybe if Wizards is having second thoughts, maybe this will help to encourage them that some of the established partners that they could have in the space were pretty alarmed and not particularly interested in operating under some of the terms that were out there in the space. So we were ready to go.
So real quick,
yeah.
Just to put a pin on this.
Yeah.
So right away, you and a bunch of people thought of this fairly soon, and other publishers came to you almost right away.
Well,
right. I'm curious how that conversation went too.
So a lot of the initial group that we had in the launch, some of those companies already had a prior business relationship with Azora Law, which is Brian Lewis's law firm. And so he had made some of those contacts, and then others of those contacts were basically friends of mine. I hit up on Facebook Messenger and was like, hey, here's what's going on. Many of us had already been in contact over the previous week just to be like, can you believe what's happening? Oh my gosh, what are you guys planning to do? I don't know. What are you guys planning to do? So I'd already had some contact with those folks. And so that's how we built that consortium, was basically a combination of friends of mine and other executives at Paizo, because the industry is so interconnected, and then connections through Brian's law firm as well. Brian and his law firm are going to be the ones who are currently drafting the ORC license. So over the next week, maybe not even week, maybe more like 4 days, then there was a sign up form, and for companies that were interested in supporting the license or being part of its development. And that soon grew. Within a day, that had over 1,000 signups on it. It then kept growing and kept growing. And it was like, wow, look at this. But the initial letter to those publishers didn't say like, do you support? It was more like, do you want to be updated on it, and do you want to be involved? But it didn't say, can we use your name to show that you're supporters of this. So out of a abundance of caution, then before we did the follow-up announcement a few days later with the 60 companies, I and a couple of other people just personally contacted every single publisher on that list, either over Zoom or over email or Facebook or whatever. Or a couple cases, those companies had already pledged their support publicly when we made the announcement. So over the course of a week and a half, I probably talked to virtually every professional contact I have in the industry over 21 years or whatever. Oh, sorry, Eric, 24 years. And so it's been a little bit like a reunion, a little bit like hanging out, a little bit like Gen Con, I guess, right? So, or Dragon Con for that matter. And so,
nothing like disaster to bring us all together.
Yeah. It's that sort of shared experience they're always talking about. And we all certainly have had a shared experience over the last month. But that kind of brings us up to the announcement of the ORC license, and middle of early last week, I think is kind of where we're at on the timeline here. And then there were more developments yet to come, of course.
Right.
But that's what we did. And then at the same time, Azora Law is working on the draft of the ORC, which we're expecting sometime in February. Not ready to quite be more specific than that. I think it's probably a safe bet not to say not the first week in February, since that is now virtually upon us, or is upon us, depending on when this goes live. But in February, Azora will have the first draft. In the meantime, we've set up a ORC licensed Discord server, and tons of publishers are giving their thoughts about how this might happen, what maybe, how we should treat this aspect of it, etc. But the model for the ORC license really is going to be the OGL 1.0a. So I certainly, I haven't seen a draft yet, but I certainly suspect that for the most part, the mechanisms and how it works will be very similar, because after all, that has served the community really well for 20 years. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Mm-hmm.
So very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting how that all came about. And you had a year of a month.
Yeah, it's been incredibly, like very little sleep. I think yesterday I finally had like an adrenaline crash after a month of, 3-hour sleeps and just working constantly from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to bed. And then also, every couple of days, some just body slam, from the latest news, or, oh my gosh, there's a new version of the license and now they're play testing a legal document. What's that all about? So it's been, it's been arduous, and I think with the latest developments, there's reason to maybe breathe a little bit of a sigh of relief, at least on the news cycle part of this, where there's a new disaster every 3 days. I think perhaps that maybe we can relax a little bit. So that's what I've been trying to do this weekend for the first time, is just take a deep breath. Don't spend a ton of time on Twitter or YouTube, and just trying to kind of, I want to paint a miniature or something. I need to engage with the part of this that isn't. It's all fun, but there's like the kind of fun when you're like running away from a tornado and you're just exhilarated. That's the kind of fun I've been having. I'm ready to have the kind of fun where I like crit a monster and everyone high fives or something like that. So
the kind of more mindless fun.
Yes, the kind where the stakes of the game are maybe not quite so high.
For sure.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm gonna close out then with have there been a few memes?
There have, yes.
On floating around, and on video, depicting you guys and a number of other personalities in the gaming community. I just wanted to know if you've seen them.
I have seen some of those. Yes.
Okay.
And I will say they range, my reaction to them ranges, because some of them are very, very funny. And there have been times where in the midst of all this stress, it honestly feels kind of good to have some mockery thrown in there. But also I've seen some that go a little far, and one of the things that I think everyone should probably keep in mind is that what I said about the industry feeling like, not competitors, but colleagues, that is definitely true of the rank and file creative people who work at Wizards of the Coast as well. And so there's, almost perhaps, I guess, inevitably, I don't really know, but I think it's worth thinking about how the chaos and just the whole unfortunate thing from the last month has been unfortunate for some of the people at Wizards as well. So when the memes get a little cruel or kind of seem to be pointed in the wrong direction and not at sort of executives who are making terrible decisions, that I think kind of makes me a little bit nervous, because I have a lot of friends over at WotC. A lot of people on their creative team got their start at Paizo. I still consider those people friends, and the idea that they could be kind of hurt by this is something I think we've all wanted to be mindful of. It's been a crazy month, but I do like the memes where like it's all rah community, but the memes that are like, I don't know. I saw a guy say, "Oh, I'm gonna go picket. I'm gonna go put up signs outside the Wizards' offices, saying how shameful everyone who works there should feel." And it's like, I feel like that's a pretty gross oversimplification of what's going on. So I have a mixed feeling about the memes, but the funny ones have offered a buoy of support in a pretty challenging couple of weeks. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for
You're
coming by
welcome.
and letting us know your story.
Indeed. If there's one thing that I could say that has been an unmitigated positive out of this whole thing is that, D&D has undoubtedly brought tens of thousands of new gamers into the hobby over the last 5 to 6, 7 years. And I think until recently, many of them have not really had an opportunity to branch out from the game that brought them into the hobby. Maybe they've wanted to, but now over the last couple of weeks, I think all of us have seen really strong sales. People are really checking out other games, and they're looking maybe to find a publisher that maybe aligns better with their ethics or what have you, or maybe they're just ready for something else. And we're seeing that happening across the industry. And although Wizards kind of pulled their foot out of their mouth a little bit on Friday with releasing more stuff into the Creative Commons and deciding that they, after all, JK, they're not going to do anything to the OGL 1.0a. Even that being said, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for other publishers, and the ORC license continues. It's great that we got what appears to be a temporary reprieve, but once you kind of have realized that fatal flaw of one company being in charge of it, who's to say it's not going to if someone's going to change the terms after 20 years, they could change the terms after 4, they could change the terms after 1, and it's just not a safe place for anybody to be, in my view. Even still, there's a reprieve. We don't necessarily have to race, to get everything set up right away. But we still feel very strongly that the ORC license is necessary. In some ways, the non-D&D publishing part of the business, I think, has been really helped by an increased level of exposure and curiosity. So we'll see what happens. But, I feel much better about the future for all of us, including Wizards of the Coast, today than I did at any time in the last month. So if there's a way for kind of, as someone once famously said, for everyone to win, then I think that that's probably the best outcome we can possibly get.
No, it's you sort of joked earlier about like the fun of running from the tornado when you just all adrenaline. But it does sort of feel like, okay, we've outrun the tornado. Now we can all breathe again. But the tornado still destroyed a lot of stuff behind us. Yeah. So where do we go from here?
I think it's an interesting question. And a week ago, before the most recent change, there was a lot of, maybe we go to this game or maybe we go here. What a neat opportunity to check out this different genre or what have you. And I really do hope that even though like you say, that the immediate tornado is maybe dispersed, I really hope people do still continue that atmosphere. That's that attitude of exploration. I think that's going to be good for the whole industry. Right. It's not good when so much of the business in the industry is tied up with one company or one game. Yeah. It's actually very risky. Right. So we'll see what happens. But I think this has been certainly an interesting chapter in the history of role-playing publishing. And I strongly suspect within a couple of years, we'll probably actually have books about what happened over the last month. I cannot wait to both be interviewed for those books and to read them, because, hopefully this interview has given a little bit of a look inside what things were like at Paizo. But I think every company, including Wizards, has that same story to tell. And it's going to take some time, I think, for everybody to be ready to talk about everything. Maybe it's 20 years from now, I really don't know, but someday you'll be able to kind of get a comprehensive look at what was going on inside all these companies and with all the content creators, all the way down, to the person just working on their first PDF. And it's going to be really interesting, I think, to look back on this and figure out what happened, why things shook out the way they did. And we don't really even know how the story ends, really. We'll see, but it has definitely not been a boring month in the tabletop RPG industry. That's for sure.
It does kind of feel like we're at the end of season 2, and there's a whole other season to go.
Right.
Yeah, I think the Friday announcement of like we're not withdrawing the OGL 1.0. That's like the stinger, and then Riker yells fire, and then it says to be continued, and now we gotta wait, for the see what happens next. Yeah.
But no, one thing I am very excited about is now I actually have friends who I can play Pathfinder 2E with, because I've had 0 friends to play 2E with so far.
Right.
So
right. Well, hoping. Here's hoping. You know, it is really all about the player network for a lot of these games. If you can't find a player, it's really tough to get started. And I think that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of games where it is now easier to find players than it would have been a month ago. For those of us who are outside the direct center bullseye of D&D or 5th edition, I think that's a really good thing for everybody. So yeah. So all's well that ends well, I guess. Ask me again in a year.
Season 3.
Yes, who knows what season 3 is going to bring? Who knows?
Okay, well, thank you everyone for watching. I'm just going to leave you with this. Dice were rolled, roles were played. Play was fun. And what else is there in life if not play? Take care.